Welcome to this Biology 6 lecture on cells and tissues. Let's begin with this now familiar diagram of the hierarchy of biological structures. And let's just quickly review the concepts here. That atoms are these small, round smallest pieces of ordinary matter, and the atoms that the human body is built out of, well, several different atoms, but some of the major ones are carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, and nitrogen atoms. And then remember that atoms can be linked together to form larger particles called molecules. And I think this is supposed to be a water molecule, but of course there are much larger molecules. Proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids are the really big molecules of living things, the macromolecules. And then the molecules are building blocks of what they call organelles. Organelles are basically the parts of cells, but I'll give a more formal definition of organelles here in a moment. Anyway, organelles are the parts of cells, and the organelles are the building blocks of cells. In other words, a cell is built out of its organelles, and then cells are the building blocks of tissues. Tissues are the building blocks of organs. Organs are the building blocks of organ systems, and the human body is made out of its organ systems. The human body is made out of 12 organ systems. So what we've been doing in the course so far is mostly talking about atoms and molecules. For instance, in the last lecture, we talked about some of the macromolecules of the body. So it's time for us to make the next jump on this hierarchy of biological structures. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the organelles of cells, but also about cells and tissues. Okay, well, let's just jump right into things then. In your lecture handout for this lecture, it tells you that cells are the smallest living units of the body, or another way of saying the same thing is cells are the smallest parts of the body. And that just means on this diagram that you see here, cells are considered to be living things, and everything higher on this diagram than cells is considered living. So cells are living things, and since cells are the building blocks of tissues, tissues are considered living. And since organs are built out of tissues, organs are considered living. So organ systems are considered living, and therefore organisms like ourselves are considered living things. So yeah, cells and everything higher on this diagram are considered alive, but anything lower on this diagram than cells is not considered a living thing. For instance, the organelles of cells, the parts of the cells like the nucleus and the cell membrane, by themselves are not considered to be alive. And likewise, the macromolecules that those organelles are built out of, like proteins and nucleic acids and other molecules, those are not considered to be alive. And individual atoms, like carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms, for example, are not considered to be alive. Anyway, that's what your handout means, saying that cells are the smallest living units of the body. Okay, now, so remember that I said a few minutes ago that the parts of a cell are called the organelles of a cell. And so if you look in the handout, the lecture handout for this lecture, it gives you the actual definition. It says organelles are the structures inside a cell that carry out the functions that keep the cell alive and operating. Well, so what does that mean? It basically means that the relationship between the organelles in a cell is similar to the relationship between the organs in your body. These organs are these structures inside your body that keep your body alive and functioning. Well, the organelles are the structures inside an individual cell that keep that cell alive and functioning. Matter of fact, the word organelle means tiny organs. Well, cells have many different organelles, but in this lecture, we're just going to cover 5 of the major organelles. And let me show a cell here. Here we go. This is my cartoon of a cell. The 5 organelles that we're going to talk about in the cell are the plasma membrane, the outer membrane of the cell. We're also going to talk about the cytoplasm, and we're going to talk about the nucleus of the cell. And we're going to talk about the vesicles of the cell. And the last organelle we're going to talk about is called the mitochondria. Okay, so what we're going to do is go through those 5 major organelles one at a time and talk about what their functions are in the cell. The first organelle that we will talk about is the plasma membrane of the cell, also called the cell membrane. Now, so the plasma membrane, the cell membrane, is the outermost part of the cell. If you picture a cell as like a microscopic water balloon, then the plasma membrane would be like the rubber skin that forms the outside of the water balloon. And you might remember from a previous lecture, the major job of the cell membrane is to stop solutes from passing through. And why is that important? Well, the cell has a bunch of important solutes, like nutrients, inside, and it doesn't want to lose those, right? So it doesn't want those important molecules that it has inside just to diffuse out of the cell. The cell would lose those then. And likewise, the molecules outside the cell could potentially be toxic, or dangerous. And so the cell doesn't want just any old molecule from the outside just drifting into the cell. And so that's why it's important that the cell's membrane be a barrier to block most solutes from passing through. Now, let's zoom in on the membrane a little bit, get a closer look at it. When we zoom in closer and closer like that, we'll start to see the molecules that the cell membrane is built out of. And here you see them. Now, you might remember what these molecules are. The ones that look like the circle with the two tails, remember those are a type of lipid molecule called a phospholipid. And so those are the major molecule that cell membranes are built out of, phospholipids. And to be a little bit more specific, you see that there are actually two layers of the phospholipids. And so we say that cell membranes are phospholipid bilayers. Now, notice also there's a molecule here that I'm showing in kind of a yellowish color there. Those are supposed to be cholesterol molecules. Cholesterol is a type of steroid lipid, but you find some cholesterol in the membranes of our cells also. So, summarizing there, so far there are two types of lipids that you find in the cell membrane: phospholipids, lots of those, and a few cholesterol, which is a steroid lipid. Okay, so remember what I said a minute ago. The major job of the cell membrane is to be a barrier that stops most solutes from passing through the membrane. And we'll see this here in just a second. Here is a solute molecule on the outside. We can see that the membrane is blocking it. Now, how exactly does the membrane block that solute from passing through? Well, it relates to the like mixes with like principle that we talked about in an earlier lecture. The membrane is very hydrophobic. These phospholipids, especially their fatty acid tails, the red parts I'm showing here, are very hydrophobic. And likewise, cholesterol is also in the lipid family, so it's a hydrophobic molecule. So the membrane, especially this middle region right here, is extremely hydrophobic. But most solutes, like that sodium ion that we just saw, are hydrophilic. And the like mixes with like principle tells us hydrophilic things don't want to mix with hydrophobic things. And for that sodium ion that we just saw to pass through the membrane, it would have to mix with the hydrophobic interior of the membrane, and hydrophilic things don't want to mix with hydrophobic things. And so really the like mixes with like principle is the basis of how the membrane acts like a barrier to most solutes. Here's another example. Imagine inside the cell is a chloride ion. Chloride ions, like sodium ions, are very hydrophilic, but again, the membrane's hydrophobic, and so that blocks the chloride ion inside the cell from passing through the membrane to get to the outside of the cell. So, most solutes are hydrophilic, and therefore the hydrophobic membrane is a barrier to most solutes from passing through. Here's sort of an exception to that rule. Let's imagine that there's a solute that is a hydrophobic solute. So here's a question: will the membrane be a barrier to that? And the answer is no, because the like mixes with like principle tells us that hydrophobic substances like to mix with other hydrophobic substances. So this hydrophobic solute molecule is not afraid to mix with the hydrophobic membrane, in other words, to pass through it. So yes, hydrophobic solute molecules can pass very easily through cell membranes. But most solutes are hydrophilic, not hydrophobic, and so that's what allows the cell membrane to be a barrier to most solutes. All right, so the lipids of the cell membrane are phospholipids and a little bit of cholesterol. In addition to the lipids, the cell membrane also has some proteins, and we've talked about these proteins, these membrane proteins, before. Remember, the term membrane protein just means any protein that's found in the cell membrane. One of these membrane protein types is called a channel protein. Sometimes called carrier proteins, but usually we call these channel proteins. And so remember, these channel proteins are proteins that form tunnels through the cell membrane, but they are not a wide open tunnel that any solute can pass through. They selectively only allow, each channel protein only allows one particular solute to pass through. And the way it works is like this. Each channel protein has a binding site that will only bind just the solute molecule that channel protein is supposed to let through. So for example, if this channel protein is for sodium ions to get through, only sodium ions will be able to bind to the protein's binding site, and therefore this particular channel protein is only a sodium channel. It does not let any other molecules through. If a different molecule, let's say a glucose molecule, comes along, this channel protein will not let it through because it doesn't bind to the binding site. Now, what if the cell wants to bring in that glucose molecule? Well, it just means the cell would have to have a different channel protein with a binding site for glucose. And that's an important point. So a typical cell might have dozens and dozens of different channel proteins. It needs a different channel protein for each type of solute molecule that it wants to bring into the cell or export out of the cell. Okay, well, a second type of membrane protein, and again, one that we've talked about, are called receptor proteins. Remember that receptor proteins detect what molecules are outside of the cell. So receptor proteins are sort of like the cell's antenna or sensors. And each receptor protein is a specialist in detecting one and only one type of solute molecule outside the cell. And the way it works is like this. Each receptor protein has a binding site that's exactly shaped to fit only the molecule that the receptor is supposed to detect. It's that lock and key specificity that we've talked about. So yeah, let's say that the molecule that this receptor is supposed to detect comes along, there it is. That molecule and only that molecule can bind to this particular receptor because the receptor's binding site is exactly shaped to fit that particular molecule. And when the receptor binds that molecule, the intracellular domain of the receptor, the part of the receptor that sticks into the cell, alerts the cell that it's detected the molecule. Alert, alert, I've detected my molecule, alert. And then the cell always has some pre-programmed response to that molecule being detected. Now, what is that pre-programmed response of the cell? Well, it really depends on which molecule has been detected and what type of cell it is. Okay, yeah, these, just like we saw with the channel proteins, each receptor is specific for just one molecule. And so a typical cell might have dozens and dozens and dozens of different receptor proteins, one for each type of molecule that the cell needs to detect. Oh, I should have also reminded you of the term extracellular domain. The extracellular domain is the part of the receptor that sticks out of the cell and binds the solute molecule. And the transmembrane domain is the part of the receptor that passes through the membrane. And of course, you remember the intracellular domain, the part that triggers the pre-programmed cellular response when the extracellular domain of the receptor has bound to the molecule. Okay, well, that's what you need to know about the cell membrane as an organelle. The next organelle that we are going to talk about is the cytoplasm. And so in the lecture handout, it tells you that the cytoplasm is defined as the watery liquid that fills the cell. If you think of the cell as like a microscopic water balloon, the cytoplasm would be like the water that fills the water balloon. However, the cytoplasm is not pure water. There are lots of dissolved molecules in the cytoplasm. And you might wonder, well, what sorts of molecules? Well, many of the ones that we've talked about so far that inside cells, like we talked about enzyme proteins being inside the cell. So enzymes are dissolved in the cytoplasm. And glucose, that sugar, is also found inside the cytoplasm. And ions like sodium ions and potassium ions and chloride ions and ATP molecules are also found in the cytoplasm. There are actually thousands of different organic molecules in the cytoplasm, but don't lose sight of the fact that the cytoplasm is mostly water. Oh, and incidentally, the organelles themselves are also considered part of the cytoplasm. Okay, now, so let me zoom out on this cell for just a second. There it is. Imagine that there's a neighboring cell, right next to this cell that we've been talking about. In some cases, there's a little opening between two neighboring cells so that their cytoplasms are connected. This type of structure is called a gap junction. And just so you know, not all cells have this. Not all cells connect to their neighbor's cytoplasm with a gap junction, but some cells do. Now you might wonder, well, why would a cell want to connect its cytoplasm to its neighbor? Well, let me give you an example. The cells that your heart is made out of are called cardiac muscle cells. And if one of those cardiac muscle cells, let's say this one, gets a contraction signal, then thanks to the fact that their cytoplasms are connected, with its neighbors through these gap junctions, the neighboring cardiac muscle cell will also have that contraction. And so, at least in heart tissue, the function of the gap junctions is to allow a whole bunch of neighboring cardiac muscle cells to contract simultaneously, and that helps the heart beat more effectively. Okay, here we are back to our view of the cell. The next organelle that we're going to talk about is the nucleus. Okay, so the nucleus is the organelle that contains the chromosomes, and of course the chromosomes are the cell's DNA, and the DNA is the genes. Some people say the genes are the blueprints for life. To be a little bit more specific, the genes are the recipes for the proteins. Yeah, so chromosomes are made out of DNA, and the DNA is the genes, the recipe for the proteins, and the chromosomes make up part of the nucleus. Now, another part of the nucleus is this thing I'm showing in purple here. That part of the nucleus is a membrane that surrounds and protects the chromosomes of the nucleus. So the nucleus is the chromosomes plus the nuclear membrane. And just to be clear, the nuclear membrane is not the same as the cell's membrane. The cell membrane is the outside here of the cell, but this is a different membrane, a special membrane of the nucleus that surrounds and protects the chromosomes. Now, when you look at cells under a microscope, you can usually see the nucleus as a large, dark organelle inside the cell. Like if you look at this cell right here, there's its nucleus right there. And if you look at this cell right here, there's its nucleus right there. It's usually a very prominent feature when you look at cells under the microscope. Okay, so back to our cartoon of the cell here. The next organelles we're going to talk about are called vesicles, these little round guys here. They can also be called vacuoles. And what they are is they're round organelles that are used for transport of materials inside the cell and also storage of materials inside the cell. So what sort of materials are we talking about here? Well, it depends on which vesicle or vacuole you're talking about, but typical things stored inside vesicles include ions and nutrients. Now, I sort of put the definitions there, vesicles and vacuoles, together as if they were the exact same thing, but they're not exactly. Vesicles are more for transport around inside the cell. That is to say, vesicles move from one organelle to another organelle inside the cell, transporting materials from one organelle to another. So they're more moving, more mobile, whereas vacuoles tend to be more stationary. They're almost like storage sheds inside the cell. Anyway, so vesicles and vacuoles are these round organelles that have various materials like nutrients and ions inside them, inside the cell. All right, well, the last organelle we're going to talk about is the mitochondria, like you see right there. The mitochondria is sometimes called the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason they call it that is it's where the ATP gets made. And so the job of the mitochondrial organelle is to make ATP. We've talked about ATP quite a bit already. It's a high energy molecule that that is the power source for the proteins inside the cell. Some of the proteins that you find inside cells, like enzymes and channel proteins, some of those proteins need energy to do their task inside the cell, and the ATP molecules provide the proteins with the energy. Now, you might remember from a previous lecture that to make the ATP molecules, the cells use glucose energy. In other words, cells take in glucose from the bloodstream, and they use the energy in the glucose sugar to power the making of the ATPs. Well, that process, the use of energy from glucose sugar to make ATPs, is called cellular aerobic respiration, and it takes place here inside the mitochondria. Yeah, so it's in the mitochondria that the energy from the glucose is utilized to make the ATP molecules, and we call that process cellular aerobic respiration. All right, well, this might be a good spot to stop and recap. So the organelles are these structures inside the cell that keep the cell alive and functioning, and we talked about several of these organelles: the plasma membrane, the cell membrane here on the outside, the cytoplasm, the liquid that fills the cell, the nucleus with its chromosomes and nuclear membrane, the vesicles and vacuoles, and the mitochondria. Okay, with that, we have finished discussing the organelles of the cell for this lecture. But remember, the organelles are the building blocks of the cell. And so for the rest of this lecture, we are going to talk about the cell as a whole, not so much anymore the organelles of the cell. And the first thing we're going to talk about cells is how cells reproduce themselves. So throughout your entire life, cells inside your body need to reproduce themselves. And the process that cells use to reproduce themselves is called mitosis. And the cells reproduce themselves by mitosis by dividing. That's how cells, well, that's how they reproduce themselves is by dividing. Now, why exactly do the cells in your body need to reproduce themselves? Why do your cells need to do mitosis? And the usual reasons are for growth and maintenance and repair of the body. Let's talk about growth. We enter this world as newborn babies. We're relatively small, obviously, and then over the next few years, we eventually grow into our adult-sized bodies. Well, that takes a lot of cellular reproduction to go from being a little baby to a full-sized adult, and so that's mitosis, cell division that cells use for our growth. And maintenance of the body also requires mitosis, cell division. Just to give an example, we're constantly losing cells from the surface of our skin, and so your skin cells have to divide to replace themselves. And another good example is your the cells that form the inner lining of your stomach. The stomach's digestive enzymes sometimes digest the stomach's parts of the stomach's own inner lining, and so those cells that form the inner lining of your stomach have to reproduce themselves. So just normal maintenance of the body requires cell division. And lastly, repair of the body. If we injure ourselves, there has to be cell division at the site of the injury to repair the injury. Okay, so mitosis is cell division, and it's how cells reproduce themselves, and it's usually done for growth and maintenance and repair of the body. Now, let me do a quick sort of tangent thought here. There is actually a second style of cell division called meiosis, which is different from the mitosis that we're going to be talking about. But meiosis is only used to make sperm and egg cells. That's the only type of meiosis division in the body, is to make sperm and egg cells. And so we're not going to talk about it right now. Towards the end of the semester, we are going to do a lecture on the reproductive system, and at that point we'll talk about sperm and egg cells and how they are made by meiosis. But other than that, other than the making of sperm and egg cells, all the cell division in your body is mitosis. And so that's what we're focusing on today. Okay, so let's kind of look at a cell dividing by mitosis. Here's the cell. You can see the nucleus in the middle there, and there's the the cell membrane there, and then this represents the cytoplasm of the cell right there. So a cell that's going to divide by mitosis, you call a mother cell. So this is a mother cell. And mitosis division is a two-step process. The first step is called nuclear division, which just means the nucleus divides. So yeah, in the nuclear division step of mitosis, the nucleus divides, and the divided nucleus, part of it goes up towards this direction, this end of the cell, and the other division of the nucleus, the other divided part of the nucleus, goes down to this part of the cell. Some people say that the two divided nuclei move to opposite poles of the cell. Anyway, so here's what nuclear division looks like. Basically, the nucleus splits in two, and the two nuclei move to opposite poles of the cell. Now, incidentally, if you read about mitosis in the textbook, which is in chapter 3 of the textbook, it talks about the steps of nuclear division, and it calls those steps prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. I'm not going to test you on those steps of nuclear division. So if you do want to read about them in the textbook, that's great, but you do not have to know them for any test questions in this class. Anyway, so nuclear division is pretty much what it sounds like. The nucleus divides, and it's the first step of mitosis. The second step of mitosis is called cytokinesis, and it's where the rest of the cell divides. So in cytokinesis, the cytoplasm and the cell membrane and all the other organelles divide in two. And so after the end of the cytokinesis step, the one original mother cell has divided into two cells. And we call the two cells that are produced from the mother cell daughter cells. So in mitosis, one mother cell divides to become two daughter cells. Okay, now, when a cell is not dividing, and you look at it under the microscope, you can usually see the nucleus as just a round dark staining structure. But when the cell is not dividing, you usually can't see any of the chromosomes inside the nucleus. But when a cell is going to go through mitosis, then you can see the chromosomes as tiny little thread-like structures. So if you see this under a microscope, you'd say, okay, this cell is not dividing because I don't see any chromosomes inside the nucleus. But if you saw a cell that looks like this, where you can see the chromosomes of the nucleus as these little tiny thread-like structures, you would know that that cell is about to go through mitosis. As a matter of fact, let's look at some of these parts of mitosis. And so this cell, we can tell, is ready to go through mitosis. The cell lines the chromosomes up in the middle of the cell, and then you start to get the nuclear division, where some of those chromosomes are moving towards this pole of the cell, and some of those chromosomes are moving towards this pole of the cell, and now they move even further apart towards opposite poles of the cell. So again, this is the nuclear division step. And then remember, after the nuclear division step, you get cytokinesis, where the membrane and the cytoplasms divide, and now that cell has become two daughter cells. And here's kind of a neat slide of some cells at various stages of division. This is actually these are actually cells from an onion, not the human body. But if these were human cells, it would look pretty similar to this. And so, for instance, in this cell right here, we can't see any chromosomes in the nucleus, so we know that this cell is not dividing at this instant. But this cell right here, we can see the chromosomes, so we know that that cell is dividing. And likewise, in this cell, we can see the chromosomes, so we know that this cell is dividing. But again, like in this cell right here, for example, we don't see the chromosomes, so we know that that cell is not dividing at the instant that they took this picture. Okay, and one more thing about cell division. Some cells in your body divide constantly, and other cells never divide. I guess I mentioned some of the cells that are constantly dividing, like your skin cells have to constantly divide to replace the skin cells that you're constantly shedding off. And the cells that make the inner lining of your stomach have to constantly divide to replace themselves, because some of those inner stomach lining cells end up getting digested by the stomach's own acids. And your blood cells have to constantly divide to replace themselves. Blood cells wear out fairly quickly. But other cells in your body never divide. As a good example, the nerve cells that make up your brain and spinal cord never divide. And that's why injuries to the brain and spinal cord, um, you don't really recover from those. You don't really heal from those. Like if a person breaks their spinal cord so they become paralyzed, that person's never going to walk again because the nervous tissue of the spinal cord just can't do mitosis. It can't reproduce to repair itself. So, and getting back for a moment to the cells that do divide constantly, like the skin cells and the cells in the inner lining of the stomach, or the blood cells, the cells that do divide constantly, they do so in a controlled manner, meaning that they only divide at the proper rate just to replace the cells that you've lost. And that leads us to the topic of cancer. Cancer is uncontrolled cell division. Cancer is where your own cells start dividing in a rapid and out of control manner. And that's dangerous because those clumps of rapidly dividing cancer cells can, which are called tumors, those tumors can spread out throughout the body and get inside many different organs inside your body. And so as those tumors, those clumps of cancer cells start growing in several organs inside your body, it disrupts the structure and functioning of those organs. And unfortunately, many times that can be fatal. Okay, I guess a quick summary here. Mitosis is the normal kind of cell division that goes on in the body, and it's for growth, repair, and maintenance of the body. Well, for today's lecture, that's all I'm going to talk about individual cells. So just to sort of recap what we've done so far, we began this lecture talking about the organelles of the cell, and then we started talking about some actions of the cell as a whole, for instance, mitosis division. And now we're going to take the next step in this diagram of the hierarchy of biological structures. Remember, cells are the building blocks of tissues, and so now we're going to talk about tissues. So if you look in your lecture handout for today's lecture, it defines a tissue as a group of cells of the same type located together. And so you can see a nice diagram here of a tissue. This looks like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 cells of the same type all physically together. So that is a tissue, a group of cells of the same type located together. And so they have to be, qualify as a tissue, they have to be cells of the same type. And incidentally, a tissue is always named after the type of cells that it's made out of. So a muscle tissue is made out of muscle cells, and nervous tissue is made out of nerve cells. Yeah, so tissues are named after the cell type that makes up that tissue. Okay, well, as it turns out, there are only 4 major tissue types in the human body, and these 4 major tissue types are called epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue, and that's it. Those are really the 4 major tissues in the human body. Now, it's actually slightly more complicated than this because some of these major tissue types have subcategories to them. For instance, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there's actually 3 types of muscle tissue, and there's 3 subcategories of muscle tissue, and there are 6 subcategories of connective tissue. And to make it even a little bit more complex, some of those subcategories have subcategories to them. But don't let that complication distract you from the basic simplicity that there are just 4 major tissue types: epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. So what we're going to do is go through these 4 tissue types one at a time, talking about the structure of these tissue types and what their function or functions are in the body. And we will start off with epithelial tissue. So if I had to define epithelial tissue in just one single word, I would say linings. And the reason I'm saying that is the inner lining, the tissue that makes up the inner lining of all your hollow organs, is always epithelial tissue. And maybe I should clarify that a bit. Not all of your organs are hollow organs, but many of your organs are hollow organs. Like your lungs are hollow, so the air could be in there, and your blood vessel organs are hollow, so the blood could flow through, and your stomach's a hollow organ, so the food could go through, and your bladder's a hollow organ, so the urine could go through. And so for any hollow organ in your body, always, 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 the tissue that makes up the inner lining of that organ is going to be epithelial tissue. And so that's why I said if I had to define epithelial tissue in one word, I would say linings. But of course, the actual definition of epithelial tissue is a little more wordy than that. So if you look in your lecture outline, epithelial tissues are defined as sheets of tightly packed cells that form protective linings and can provide surfaces for absorption and secretion of materials. Well, let's dissect that definition of epithelial tissues a little bit. So the first part says epithelial tissues are sheets of tightly packed cells. What does that mean? It just means the cells are tightly packed together. This is an epithelial tissue, and you can see there's no real space between the cells. They're packed shoulder to shoulder very tightly with their neighbors. So that's one characteristic of epithelial cells, that they're packed very tightly together. And in terms of the function, I guess I already mentioned it. Epithelial tissues form protective linings in the body, and to be a little bit more specific, they form the inner lining of all hollow organs. So your lungs, their innermost lining is epithelial tissue, and your stomach, its innermost lining is epithelial tissue, and your small intestine, your large intestine, your blood vessels, and your bladder, and if you're a female, your uterus, all those are hollow organs, and so their inner lining is always going to be epithelial tissue. And what is that inner lining for? It's basically to protect the organ from what's flowing through that organ, because for all your hollow organs, there's something that's passing through that organ, right? For your blood vessel hollow organs, there's blood passing through. For your bladder hollow organ, it's urine that's passing through. For your stomach hollow organ, it's the food that's passing through. So all these hollow organs, there's something passing through. So to protect the organ from the substance that's passing through, that's the function of the epithelial tissue that makes up the inner lining. It's a protective inner lining. Now, for some of these hollow organ epithelial tissues, the epithelial tissue, in addition to being a protective inner lining, also secretes and absorbs materials. And a good example of that is the stomach. So the stomach being a hollow organ, its inner lining is epithelial tissue, but it's not just a protective lining. The epithelial tissue of the stomach secretes acids and digestive enzymes to mix with the food inside the stomach. And also, the epithelial tissue of the stomach then absorbs nutrients from the digested food. So in some cases, epithelial tissues absorb and secrete materials, but that's not always the case. Some of them are just protective linings, and they don't really absorb or secrete anything. For instance, the epithelial tissue that forms the inner lining of the bladder is just a protective lining. It does not secrete anything into the urine, and it does not absorb anything from the urine. It's just a protective lining. Okay, I was actually going to show you some pictures. So as an example of some hollow organs that have and their inner epithelial lining, let's talk about blood vessels. This artery here is a type of blood vessel, and so is this vein right here. And if you look closely, you can see they've colored in sort of a golden tissue layer to be the innermost lining, and that's the epithelial tissue. You can see it there, the inner lining of these blood vessel hollow organs. Well, like I said, all hollow organs in the body, the epithelial tissue is the inner lining. Okay, so that's epithelial tissues. They form protective inner linings of all your hollow organs. The next tissue we're going to talk about is muscle tissue. Now, if I had to define muscle tissue in just one single word, the word I would pick would be movement, because that's what muscle tissue causes. But if you look in the lecture handout, it gives the actual definition. It says muscle tissue is the tissue that causes movement by contracting, meaning shortening its cells. And so let me just kind of give you a visual of that. I'll use the bicep muscle as an example. Here's the bicep muscle in your arm, and it causes movement. And what it does is it allows you to flex up, to bend your forearm there at the elbow joint. And how does your bicep muscle do that? Well, it contracts itself. The whole muscle tissue here of the bicep contracts. It makes itself smaller. And when it does, it ends up pulling on these bones here in the forearm, and that's what allows your forearm to flex upward like that when you contract your bicep muscle. Now, how did that muscle tissue in the bicep contract? Well, muscle tissue is made out of muscle cells. And so what actually happened is all the individual cells, all the individual muscle cells in the muscle tissue contracted. That's what allowed the muscle tissue as a whole to contract. Now, we can't see the individual muscle cells in this cartoon, but yeah, if you could see them, the individual muscle cells are what contract when you contract a muscle tissue. And so it's really the contraction of the individual muscle cells which allow the muscle tissue to cause movement of the body. Okay, just as a quick review question, does anybody remember the name of these dense connective tissue structures that connect muscle to bone? Those are called tendons, and just thought I'd throw that in. Anyway, so getting back to this lecture on muscle tissue. Now you might wonder, well, how is it that muscle cells can contract themselves? And we're not going to talk about it in today's lecture. Later on in the semester, we're going to do an entire lecture on muscles, and at that point, I'll tell you how individual muscle cells contract themselves. Okay, there is one last concept I want you to know about muscle tissue, and that is that there are three types of muscle tissue. In other words, there are three subcategories of muscle tissue. And if you look in the lecture handout for this lecture, it lists them for you. They're called skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. So I want to finish this section on muscles by going through those three types of muscle tissue. Okay, we'll start off with skeletal muscle tissue. This bicep muscle you'll see here is an example of that. Okay, skeletal muscle tissue is attached to the bones of your body, the bones of your skeleton. And incidentally, that's why they call it skeletal muscle tissue, because it's attached to the bones. And what skeletal muscle tissue does is it moves your body parts for you. I showed you just a minute ago an example of the bicep, moving the forearm, flexing the forearm at the elbow. Let me see if I can go back to that. Here it is. Yeah, so there's your bicep right there. And so remember the way it works. When your bicep contracts, that creates a pulling force, and by way of these tendons, it pulls on the bones here in your forearm, and that moves your forearm. It flexes your forearm at the elbow joint, right? Well, that's the job of skeletal muscles. They move body parts for you, and they do so by contracting and therefore pulling on your skeleton, and that moves your body parts. And just so you know, it's not just the bones of your forearm that's moved by skeletal muscles. All throughout your arms and your fingers and your legs and your torso and your neck and your face and your chest, you have skeletal muscles all over your body, and that's what allows you to move your various body parts, your fingers, your legs, and your toes, and your arms. It's all skeletal muscles that cause movement of your body parts. Now, one last thing about skeletal muscle tissue: it is the only voluntary tissue, voluntary muscle tissue type. And what does that mean? Well, voluntary means that you have conscious control when that muscle contracts or relaxes, right? You decide if you're going to contract your bicep and flex up your forearm, or relax it and extend your forearm, right? Or you can decide whether you want to move your leg in any given direction, or flex your neck in any given direction, right? And so what that means is you have conscious control over the skeletal muscles in your arms and your legs and your torso and your neck and your face. You have conscious control over all of your skeletal muscles. You control when they contract and relax, and that's what we mean by voluntary. So skeletal muscle is the only voluntary muscle type. All right, well, let's go on to the second of the three muscle tissue types. The second of the three muscle tissue types is called smooth muscle, and it's found only in the walls of hollow organs. Now, earlier in this lecture, I listed some hollow organs to you. These are your intestines that you see here, but your stomach is another example of a hollow organ. Your blood vessels are hollow organs. Your bladder's a hollow organ. If you're a female, your uterus is a hollow organ. There are many hollow organs throughout your body, and you have those hollow organs because something flows through that organ, right? Your food goes through your stomach and intestine hollow organs, and the blood goes through your blood vessel hollow organs, and the urine goes through your bladder hollow organ. Yeah, so all of your hollow organs always have some sort of substance that's supposed to move through them. And anyway, that's where you find smooth muscle. You always find it in the walls of hollow organs. And what it's doing there, what its job is to propel the substance through the organ. And I like to describe how that works, how the smooth muscle propels substances through a hollow organ by what I call the toothpaste principle. Imagine a tube of toothpaste, and the toothpaste is a substance inside the tube, right? Well, if you just hold the toothpaste tube gently in your hand, then the toothpaste doesn't move, right? But if you squeeze on the toothpaste tube, then the toothpaste does move through the tube. It squirts out of the tube, right? Well, as long as the cap is off of the toothpaste tube. But yeah, so think about that. If you've uncapped your toothpaste tube and then you squeeze on it with your fingers, that propels the toothpaste out of the tube, right? The toothpaste comes squirting out of the tube. Well, yeah, I call that the toothpaste principle. And that's how the smooth muscles propel the substances through your hollow organs, by squeezing inward on the substance inside the organ. So imagine that there's some food somewhere inside one of these intestines right here. Well, when the body wants that food to move, to a different location in the digestive system, the body makes the smooth muscle in the wall of the intestines squeeze. And just like that propels the toothpaste, that propels the food, out of that organ into the next digestive system organ. Yeah, so that's what smooth muscle is all about. You find it in the walls of hollow organs, and when it contracts, it propels the substance through that hollow organ. Now, smooth muscle is an involuntary muscle tissue, and that means you do not have conscious control when it contracts and relaxes. You cannot consciously make your smooth muscle in the walls of your hollow organs contract, and you cannot consciously make it relax. Your body runs that for you. Your body contracts and relaxes the smooth muscle tissue in your body for you. You do not do it consciously, so it's involuntary. It's an involuntary muscle tissue type. Okay, and the last of our three muscle tissue types is called cardiac muscle tissue, and it's found in the heart, and only in the heart. The heart is the only organ in your body that has cardiac muscle tissue. The job of the cardiac muscle tissue is to pump the blood. Your heart is a hollow organ. There's hollow chambers inside of it that fill up with blood, and when the cardiac muscle tissue of the heart contracts, it squeezes on that blood, and that squirts the blood out of the heart. It's essentially the toothpaste principle all over again. But when it does that, when the cardiac muscle tissue of the heart contracts and squirts the blood out of the heart, that makes the blood circulate throughout your body. So yeah, the cardiac muscle tissue is found in the heart, and its job is to pump the blood throughout the body. Cardiac muscle tissue is also an involuntary muscle tissue type. You do not have conscious control over when your heart muscle contracts or relaxes. Your heart does that for you. All right, well, so that brings us to the end of our discussion of the three muscle tissue types. And just to recap, skeletal muscle tissue is attached to the bones. It's a voluntary muscle tissue type. You control when it contracts and relaxes, and it moves your body parts for you. There's smooth muscle found in the walls of hollow organs. It's involuntary, and when it contracts, it moves the substance through the hollow organ. And there is cardiac muscle tissue, which is also involuntary, and when it contracts, it pumps the blood. It makes the blood circulate throughout the body. Okay, that wraps it up for our discussion of muscle tissue. The next tissue we're going to talk about, the next of the four major tissue types, is called nervous tissue. And you find nervous tissue pretty much at all locations throughout the body. These areas right here, nervous tissue, and these yellowish areas right there are nervous tissue also. So yes, you find nervous tissue pretty much everywhere in the body. But that being said, the two organs in the body, the two largest organs in the body that are made out of nervous tissue are the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so what is the function of nervous tissue? Well, if you read the handout, it says that nervous tissue is for detecting stimuli and transmitting signals rapidly between body parts. Okay, so let's dissect that. When we say that nervous tissue is for detecting stimuli, what's a stimulus? A stimulus is basically the things that we can sense. So we can sense touches, we have a sense of touch, and we can sense sights, that's our sense of vision, and we can sense sounds, and we can sense tastes, and we can sense smells. And so I'm saying it's nervous tissue that actually detects all of those sense stimuli. And just to give an example of that, let's imagine that this woman here is being bothered by a fly. Bzzz, this is a fly buzzing around her. Bzzz, 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 and let's say the fly lands on her shoulder for some reason. Bzzz, starts walking around. Okay, well, it's the nervous tissue in her skin that would detect that touch stimulus, right? When the fly is walking on her skin, that's a touch stimulus. And so, yes, it's the nervous tissue there in her shoulder where the fly is walking that detects the touch stimulus from the fly. That's an example of nervous tissue detecting stimuli. Now, for her to be aware that the fly is on her skin, her brain has to get the signal that she's feeling a touch on her shoulder, because your consciousness, your awareness is up here in your brain. And so this brings in the second function of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue not only detects stimuli, but it also transmits signals rapidly between body parts, like in this example from her shoulder up into her brain. So yeah, think of the nervous tissue, one of its functions is being like the body's internal telegraph system for sending information rapidly from one body part to another. And that's what we'll see here. After the nervous tissue in her skin detected that touch from the fly, nervous tissue also carries that signal, that nerve signal, up through her shoulders, up through her spinal cord, and into her brain. So she's now consciously aware that something is touching her shoulder. Now, when the brain receives some nervous signals like that, you have thoughts about it. She's going to say, oh, I feel something walking on my arm. Oh, I think it's a bug. I don't like bugs. I want to brush it off. Well, our thoughts about thing, our mental process of thinking is also nervous tissue sending signals back and forth. Our thoughts are where the nervous tissue of the brain is sending signals back and forth between various regions of the brain. So that your thoughts, your mental processing, is also an example of nervous tissue transmitting signals between body parts. It's signals between various regions of the brain. Now, eventually, she's going to come to at the end of her thought processing, she's going to want to have some sort of response, like she probably wants to brush the fly off her arm, and so that's going to involve contracting some muscles in her arm, right? Well, this is yet another example of nervous tissue sending signals rapidly between body parts, because to contract the muscles in her arm, she has to send a nervous signal down from her brain to the muscles in her arm. And so yet again, that's an example of nervous tissue sending signals rapidly between body parts. So, to summarize so far, nervous tissue is the tissue that senses stimuli, things like tastes and smells and sounds and sights and touches, and it's also the tissue that sends signals rapidly between body parts. Now, the cells of nervous tissue that actually sense the stimuli and transmit the signals are called neuron cells. Some people call them nerve cells, but the correct term is neuron cells. And here's a photograph of a neuron cell. Now, we're going to do an entire lecture on the nervous system later on in the semester, and at that point we'll learn quite a few details about neuron cells and how they function. But just as a preview, you see these parts of the neuron cell here that look like tree branches. Those are called dendrites, and they are the part of the neuron that detects the stimuli. Because remember, that's one of the functions of nervous tissue, is detecting stimuli. That's what the dendrites do. They are the part of the neuron for detecting the stimulus. And notice this other part of the neuron that's a long skinny part right here. That's called the axon. And that's the part of the neuron that transmits signals rapidly between body parts. All right, so that's it for nervous tissue. It's made out of the cells of the nervous tissue that that detect the stimuli and carry the nerve signals between body parts are called the neurons. Okay, well, the last of our four major tissue types is called connective tissue. Connective tissues are defined as tissues that surround, support, or protect other tissues and organs. Now, connective tissues are a little bit detailed, a little bit complicated. And the reason I'm saying that is that there are 6 types of connective tissues. In other words, there are 6 subcategories of connective tissues. And here they are listed, and they are also listed in the lecture handout. The 6 types of connective tissue are called loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, bone, cartilage, adipose, and blood. Yeah, so 6 subcategories of connective tissue. And to make things even more complicated, some of these subcategories of connective tissue actually have subcategories to them. Okay, yeah, so these are the 6 types of connective tissue that you see listed here. Now, so if you look at these tissues listed here, they seem pretty diverse from each other, right? For instance, bone is a hard, almost rock-like tissue, whereas blood, that's a flowing, liquidy tissue, right? So you may wonder, well, why are these tissues that are so different from each other all lumped together into this connective tissue category? Well, tissues are defined as connective tissues not because they are solids or liquids. They're defined as connective tissues based on what they do. And so if you look at again, returning to the definition of connective tissue, it's tissues that surround, support, or protect other tissues and organs. And so that's what all of these have in common. That's what makes them connective tissues. They all either surround, support, or protect other tissues and organs in the body. And let me just give you a quick example of such a thing. So bone is one of the connective tissues in the body, and it's very easy to pick an example of how bone surrounds and supports and protects another organ in the body. Here is a picture of the skull bones in sort of the whitish color you see there. And what organ do they surround and support or protect? Well, the brain, of course, right? And so that's why bone is considered a connective tissue. It surrounds and supports and protects another organ, in this case that organ being the brain. Yeah, so all 6 of the connective tissues in some way surround, support, and protect other tissues or organs in the body. That's what makes them connective tissues. Now, the connective tissues have an interesting trait, and what that trait is, their cells generally do not touch each other. So the next slide shows a close-up of connective tissue, and you can see these little dark spots. Those are the cells of the connective tissue. And notice that they are not packed tightly together. The cells of connective tissue don't touch each other. And that's kind of different, right? A few minutes ago, we talked about another tissue in the body where the cells are packed tightly together. Just as a review question, does anybody remember that tissue that we just mentioned earlier in this lecture, where part of the definition was that the cells are packed tightly together? The answer is epithelial tissue. And so I'm saying connective tissues are sort of the opposite of epithelial tissues. Connective tissues, as you can see here, the cells don't touch each other, whereas in epithelial tissues, the cells do touch each other. They're packed tightly. Anyway, yeah, so that's a trait of epithelial tissues in general. The cells of that's a trait of the cells of connective tissues. In general, the cells of connective tissues don't touch each other. Now, you may wonder, well, there's got to be something between these cells of the connective tissue. Well, there is, and the material that fills the space between the cells of a connective tissue is called the extracellular matrix of the connective tissue. Now, you might wonder, well, what is this extracellular matrix made out of? Well, it really depends on which of the 6 connective tissues you're talking about. In some of the connective tissues, the extracellular matrix is a solid material. In other of the 6 connective tissues, the extracellular matrix is a jelly-like material, a gel. And in other of the six connective tissues, the extracellular matrix, is a liquid. And so, yeah, the characteristics of the extracellular matrix of the connective tissue really depend on which of the six connective tissues you are talking about. Okay, so getting back to our list here of these six types of connective tissues, what we're going to do is just go through them one at a time. So let's begin with loose connective tissue. The lecture handout defines loose connective tissue, which is sometimes called areolar connective tissue. It's defined as a soft, flexible connective tissue. And so you can sort of think of loose connective tissue as sort of the body's packing foam. Like if you're trying to send something sort of delicate through the mail, when you put it in the box that you're going to ship it in, you put some packing foam around it, right, to help protect it. So loose connective tissue is a soft and flexible, jelly-like connective tissue. And yeah, the body uses it as sort of a packing foam to surround and protect other tissues and organs. Let me give you an example of that. In this slide right here, this part right here is a capillary. Capillaries are small blood vessels. But all this tissue that you see right here outside the capillary, all this tissue that surrounds and protects the capillary, is loose connective tissue. You can see the cells of the loose connective tissue, these little dark dots there. And so just as a review question, the material that fills up the space between the cells of a connective tissue is called the what of the connective tissue. And the answer is extracellular matrix. Yes, so the extracellular matrix of loose connective tissue is a soft jelly-like substance, and that's what makes loose connective tissue a soft and jelly-like connective tissue. All right, so let's get back to our list of the six connective tissue types. That's loose connective tissue, soft jelly-like connective tissue. The next of our six connective tissue types is called dense connective tissue, and it's sort of the opposite of loose connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is a strong and leathery connective tissue. Here's a microscopic close-up of dense connective tissue. The dark spots are the cells of the dense connective tissue, like there's a dense connective tissue cell, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one, and there's one. But look here, the extracellular matrix between the cells, it looks like this pink stuff, right? What is that stuff in the extracellular matrix of the dense connective tissue? It's collagen protein. We talked about collagen protein when we talked about the proteins of the body. Collagen protein is a strong, leather-like protein. And so notice in dense connective tissue, pretty much the entire extracellular matrix is made out of collagen protein. And since collagen protein is a tough and leathery protein, dense connective tissue is going to be a tough and leathery connective tissue. And so the more collagen, or I should say, it's the collagen in the extracellular matrix of the dense connective tissue that gives the dense connective tissue its tough, strong, and leathery characteristics. Now, there are actually many organs that have some dense connective tissue in them, but the organs in the body that have the most connective tissue are tendons and ligaments. And I've talked about these a couple times already this semester. Tendons are structures that connect muscle to bone. These little gray shapes that you see there and there and there and there are the tendons that connect these muscles to the surrounding bones. And if you think about it, tendons have to be very strong because your muscles can generate hundreds of pounds of force, and that force has to be transmitted to the bones through these tiny little tendons. So the tendons, better be a very strong and tough material. So that's why the body makes the tendons out of dense connective tissue. Now, this picture doesn't have any pictures of ligaments, but ligaments connect bone to bone, and ligaments would look just like tendons. Ligaments are also made out of dense connective tissue. Okay, so to summarize that, dense connective tissue is a tough, leathery connective tissue. The next of our six types of connective tissue is bone tissue. All right, so if you look at the lecture handout, it defines bone tissue this way. It says bone tissue is a rock-like connective tissue that forms the bones, and of course the bones surround, protect, and anchor other organs. And let me just give some examples of that. So I guess I mentioned this already. The purpose of your skull bones is to surround and protect your brain. The purpose of your ribs bones is to surround and protect your heart and your lungs. The purpose of your vertebrae, the bones of your spine, is to surround and protect your spinal cord. And so anyway, that's why bone tissue is one of the connective tissues. So remember, the connective tissues surround and support and protect other tissues and organs. That's certainly what your bones are doing. That's why bone is classified as a connective tissue. Okay, so the next slide shows a close-up of bone tissue, and the little dark spots are the bone cells, and the material between the cells of a connective tissue is called its extracellular matrix. So all this gray-looking stuff you see here between the bone cells is the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. And one of the major things that the extracellular matrix of bone tissue is made out of is a rock-like substance called calcium phosphate. So this is mostly calcium phosphate in the extracellular matrix. And incidentally, that's why it's important to get calcium in your diet if you want to have strong bones. If you want to have a healthy skeleton, is because calcium is a part of the extracellular matrix of the bone. Okay, so summarizing, bones are a rock-like connective tissue, and cartilage is a rubber-like connective tissue. Cartilage is a rubbery connective tissue. You find cartilage in several places throughout the body, but generally it's found where organs need a rubbery cushioning surface to protect them. And let me give a good example here. Here's the knee joint right here. And, a lot of weight is, almost your entire body weight is coming down on the bones in the knee joint. And so to protect the bones of the knee joint from grinding against each other, there are sheets of protective cartilage between the bones in the knee joint. Matter of fact, let's have a close-up of the knee joint. Here it is right there. There's one of the bones of the knee joint, and here are some other bones. And you see this material right here between the bones. So that is cartilage. And so yeah, that's one of the functions of cartilage. It provides rubbery protective cushioning surfaces between some of the joints where the bones meet each other in the body. And I don't have a picture of it here, but between your vertebrae, which are the bones of your spine, you also find some cushioning cartilage discs. Okay, so cartilage, a rubbery connective tissue, and one of the places you find it is it makes cushioning rubbery surfaces between some of the bones in the body. The next of our 6 types of connective tissue is adipose tissue, and in a word, adipose tissue is fat tissue. So if you look in the lecture handout, it defines it this way. Adipose tissue is a connective tissue that specializes in storing triglyceride molecules. But remember, triglycerides is the official name for fat molecules. So yeah, adipose tissue stores fat molecules for us. And why does our body want to store fat molecules? Well, a couple of reasons. Fat molecules are intrinsically high energy molecules, and so our bodies store triglycerides as a way of storing energy. In other words, if you get more calories, more energy in your diet than your body needs, your body wants to store that energy for your future energy needs, and so your body can take some of the calories in your foods and convert them into fat. In addition, the adipose tissue, the fat tissue of your body, also serves as insulation. It helps hold your body heat in. Okay, now, so the next slide shows a close-up of some adipose tissue. The official name for the cells of adipose tissue is adipocytes. So here's an adipocyte, and here's an adipocyte, and here's an adipocyte, and here's one, and here's one, and here's one, and there's one, and there's one. So at first these adipocytes look empty, look sort of empty and white, but they're not actually empty. That white stuff inside is a big ball of triglyceride molecules, a ball of fat molecules. Yeah, so every adipocyte is just filled with what they call a fat droplet, just a ball of triglyceride molecules, because that's its job is to store fat for energy storage and insulation. Now, notice something interesting here. These in adipose connective tissue, the connective tissue cells, the adipocytes, are packed tightly together. And that's different, right? At the beginning of this section here on connective tissues, I told you that generally the cells of connective tissue don't touch each other. They're not packed together. They're kind of spaced apart from each other. But adipose tissue is the exception to that rule. In adipose connective tissue, the cells are packed tightly together. In fact, that adipose tissue is the only connective tissue where the cells are packed tightly together. Okay, so adipose tissue is fat tissue. It stores triglycerides, fat molecules, for us. The last of our 6 types of connective tissue is blood. And sometimes when I say that, people say, Mr. Reedens, blood is a body fluid. It's not a tissue. Well, blood is a liquid. It is a fluid, but it is also a tissue of the body. It's one of the 6 connective tissues. So if we look up in the lecture outline, the definition of blood tissue is defined like this: blood is a liquid connective tissue that transports things like nutrients and oxygen and wastes and other molecules throughout the body. So yeah, that's the purpose of blood. The blood carries nutrients and oxygen and other molecules, and when the heart pumps the blood and circulates that blood throughout the body, that allows all the cells in your body to have access to those nutrients and oxygen that they need, and also allows the cells to get rid of their wastes by dumping their wastes into the blood. Yeah, so if I just summarize the function of blood in just one word, I would say transportation. It transports materials throughout the body. The next slide is a close-up of blood, of blood tissue. Here it is. The little pink-looking spots and this cell and that little tiny dark spot are all blood cells. So that's a type of blood cell. That's a type of blood cell. And even that tiny little dark spot is a type of blood cell. So as you can see, there are several different types of blood cells. Later on in the semester, we're going to do an entire lecture on the blood, and I'll talk about the 3 major types of blood cells then. But for this lecture, I want to emphasize the extracellular matrix. So remember, the extracellular matrix is the part of the connective tissue that's between the cells. And in blood, the extracellular matrix is called plasma, and the plasma is a watery liquid. Blood is the only connective tissue that has a liquid extracellular matrix. All right, so to summarize, blood is for transporting materials throughout the body, and the extracellular matrix of blood, the material between the blood cells, is a liquid that's called plasma. Okay, so that wraps it up for our 4 major tissue types of the body. Again, the 4 major tissue types are epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. And as we learned, there are actually 6 subcategories of connective tissue: loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, bone, cartilage, adipose, and blood. Whew. Okay, so you are now expert in the tissues of the body. Let's return now to the slide we started with, which is the hierarchy of biological structures. And so, so now you're an expert in this level, the tissue level. And remember that tissues are the building blocks of organs. So all organs are made of several tissues working together. let's use this as an example. This is supposed to be the stomach, I believe. And if you look closely, you can see it's made out of 3 different tissue layers, which we use 3 different colors there to show. Yeah, so this demonstrates that the stomach, like all organs, is made out of several tissues. Tissues are the building blocks of organs. Now, just as a quick review question, this tissue that they're showing in kind of a golden color there, notice that tissue is the innermost tissue, the inner lining of the stomach. And so what type of tissue do you know that that has to be, since it's the inner lining of a hollow organ? That's right. That is that must be epithelial tissue. You might wonder, well, what are these other tissue layers in the stomach? Well, we'll talk about the digestive system later on in this semester, but in case you're curious, the layer underneath the epithelial layer in the stomach is dense connective tissue, and then the layer outside of that is muscle tissue. But yeah, don't worry about that for today. We'll get to that when we talk about the digestive system. Okay, then, and of course, organs are the building blocks of organ systems, and organ systems are the building blocks of your body. So, we're now ready, now that you understand tissues, we're ready to start talking about organs and organ systems, which are really what this class is going to focus on. We're going to talk about the physiology of the organs and the organ systems of the body. Okay, so that brings it an end to this lecture. As usual, I recommend that you now do the review questions on this topic, but I will see you in the next lecture.